Ladies and gentlemen, we are very fortunate, rather honored to have Professor Lee No as our speaker. She is a prominent scholar and diplomat who served as a Korean ambassador to Russia and Finland, and also she taught at Seoul National University, Korea University, and also Barnard University in the United States. And she also served as the president of a Korea Foundation. She was educated at Seoul National University and Wellesley and Harvard University. She's a Russian history specialist, and she's going to share with us some of her thoughts on very interesting and controversial topic of rewriting Korean history. So without further ado, Professor Lee No.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me here. As a matter of fact, I used to be a member of this society before I went away. Well, my presentation tonight is not going to be as scholarly or as well organized as those that you are accustomed to hearing. But I'm addressing a topic which is very much to my heart. And so what I say tonight will be really something that's impressionistic and personal rather than anything based on scholarly research. After all, I'm a Korean who has lived for 70 years. And most of those years were spent in my own country, of course. And unfortunately, the Korea we see today is not exactly what I had hoped to see. As you all know, only a few years ago, Korea was looked upon as a great success story. This country has achieved, finally, the country succeeded in democratizing its political system, and also from a very poor, war-torn country, it has risen to be one of the big economic entities in the world. As all of you here know, this country was built up from scratch after the country was liberated in 1945. And the United States, which was the country most instrumental in defeating Japan and liberating Korea, was also the power that has given the foundation upon which the Republic of Korea was built and saved this country from a certain destruction during the initial few months of the Korean War, and has also helped to develop its economy and also inspired to achieve democratization. But now, as you all know, anti-Americanism has risen so sharply over the past several years that I'm sure our American friends all feel enormous sense of betrayal. And there are actually many, many Koreans who share this feeling. But it is at this point very important to understand why this is happening, so that we can move from this point on in the direction in which this, what to my mind is a rather worrisome trend, will not continue in force. And I thought, as a historian, the best way to understand what is going on is, again, going back to our history and see what kind of history we have really lived through. I'd say this is country. Korea is a country which is now engaged in a search for identity. It may sound strange, but it really is the word. And I called the talk tonight Rewriting Korean History, because this is the attempt that is going on. And there's enormous controversy, and the controversy is in fact an understatement. There is a genuine war. Well, Korea, as you know, was a small country, hardly known to the world outside, until China began to collapse under the impact of Western inroad. And as a small country that used to live under the Chinese umbrella, Korea's intellectual establishment, which was at that time synonymous with the political class, didn't know what to do. So the first slogan was really to do everything to oust whatever was, what is an equivalent of the evil, the foreign evil, 위정 척사. But there were Koreans who were more enlightened and saw the need to modernize this country. But it was already too late by the time this realization came. Korea was forced to open its ports to foreign countries, starting with Japan and then with the United States, England, and so forth. Already at that time, the old elite was caught in a dilemma, especially after the country fell to Japan in 1910. By the Confucian standard, betraying your king or your country was tantamount to really ceasing to be a decent human being. But on the other hand, even before that, those who were aware of the need to modernize the country knew that some sort of a compromise had to be worked out. And China was not such an easy overload. And so naturally, there were groups of young politicians who thought that working with Japan might be the better road to travel. So when the country fell, the old establishment was caught in a no-win situation. Those who were thinking in moralistic terms had no choice but to flee the country or just become internal emigre. The other road was collaboration with Japan. Even with the younger generation, you had to accept the colonial system to get the education needed to build up Korea's real strength. So the modernizers were blamed for putting up with the situation and betraying the country, while the old guard had a moral mandate, but they were helpless. You may be amused to hear that Ewha University, the Ewha educational establishment, started with a class in which the concubine of a modernizer was the only pupil. And in fact, many Korean women, the first generation of Korean women who got modern education, got their education because they jumped out of the old hierarchical and conventional concept of family living. So by the time their education was finished, they were too old to find a husband, and very often they ended up becoming the second wife who had to get rid of the legitimate first wife. So this is a sort of symbolic of the conflict that this country faced from early on. when regaining independence was the foremost goal, there was at least a national consensus within. There were, of course, always people who thought of their personal advantages. I mean, after all, life had to go on. But still, underneath it all, even those who seemingly collaborated with the Japanese were also Korean patriots in their own way. And very often the style of living was such that a Korean businessman will bribe the Japanese authorities, make money, and then send money to those who are fighting for independence abroad. Christianity and communism came in as the two new rays of hope. As you know, the Russian Revolution took place in 1917, and immediately Lenin sent out messages to those peoples like Koreans living under foreign oppression. So the twin formula of liberation from what they call feudal oppression and national oppression and collaborating with the national bourgeoisie was a formula very cleverly designed to win the hearts of the nationalistically minded new intelligentsia in this country. Christianity was the other message, but of course, as being religion, they were more devoted to the cause of enlightenment and social welfare and so forth, rather than sending out straightforward political message. So the country was liberated and then divided in 1945. Maybe South Korea had more pro-Marxist intellectuals than North Korea, because there were richer families here who could afford to send their children to universities in Japan or Japanize the university here. The division was something that was, of course, totally unexpected, a shattering blow. But in retrospect, division was a development that Koreans could not have prevented. Cold War had already started. And the United States, of course, was not about to give up the entire Korean peninsula, a former colony of Japan, which they had to fight so hard to defeat. Russians had declared the war only after the Hiroshima bombing, when Japanese surrender was already a foregone conclusion. But Russians were right across the border, and they quickly marched in while the Americans were still in Okinawa. So when the situation seemed as if the division was going to last, well, this is something that, of course, the leaders at that time did not see. The Americans being, Americans, they were straightforward in issuing, for instance, statement. They treated Korea as the former colony of a defeated enemy, whereas the Russians were much more clever in the wording of the proclamation. They styled themselves out to be the army of liberation. We are here only to help you build your own country, and we are all for sponsoring all nation, all-party government. Well, I don't think neither Russia nor Americans really wanted to see this country divided, but neither side was willing to see the other half of the peninsula to the other side. Our national leaders, to the very end, were hopeful that the division could be avoided. Dr. Syngman Rhee, who was a Princeton Ph.D., was perhaps the only one of our older generation leaders who saw the nature of Stalinist system, and he was determined from the beginning to prevent communization of southern part of the country. The Americans had really no love for Syngman Rhee, who was very obstinate, and he was really a very hard bargainer. Yet, after all, he was the person who understood the America's need not to yield to the Soviet Union. So he became the first president of this country, whereas the Russians had chosen Kim Il-sung, who was one of the many Koreans who had fought in the Soviet or Manchurian territory and had served as a junior officer in their army. There were other communist leaders with much greater prestige and domestic following, like Park Chung-hee. And to the Soviets, of course, Park Chung-hee was not such a palatable figure because he had too much independence. It would have been something like a Tito. So they chose Kim Jong-il. But in the written language, it looked as if the Soviets were out of the scene and North Korea was being organized by the Koreans themselves, whereas South had to put up with American military government until the Republic was established. I'm mentioning this because all these are coming up in this current debate, reinterpreting Korean history. Also, in North Korea, a much neater job was done in getting rid of what was called the Japanese collaborators. After all, when you introduce a communist system or para-communist system, you get at anybody who is propertied, and naturally, those who had anything had to have compromised with the Japanese. But even in North Korea, they made exception of those who had joined the Communist Party and also those who were regarded to be as desirable human material. But in the South, the Americans did not really understand the deeper sense of, or the deep sense of resentment the Koreans had toward the Japanese or Japanese collaborators. The urgent need was to restore and maintain order, and only those who had been trained under the Japanese were capable of undertaking the task. And the communist provocation was there from the beginning. It was a situation when anybody, regardless who it was, who succeeded in becoming the foremost political leader of the president, was to be blamed for having sold the country for the sake of power, or for having sold half of the country for the sake of power. Already when President Syngman Rhee became our first president, he chose to take the Korea issue to the United Nations, and the United Nations accepted this proposal and wanted to have nationwide election, but the Soviets blocked entry of the United Nations supervising team. So election could take place only in the South. So the two separate political systems had to be established in 1948. Actually, in actuality, by that time, Stalin had already seen the draft of North Korea's constitution, and North Korea already had People's Army and all the trappings of the new state. But in record, it appears as if it was Syngman Rhee who made a speech in 1947 calling for the need to establish an independent government and get rid of the American military government. So now in the revisionist circles, he is blamed for the permanent division, whereas Kim Gu and Kim Gyu-sik, two of the leaders who went to North Korea on the eve of the election and to parley for to prevent the division of the peninsula, and boycotted the election. They are now made out to be the genuine national leaders. But in actuality, there are documents which prove that the Soviets themselves, in fact, the Politburo itself thought about this issue when Kim Gu wanted to come to North. Already, because the North Korea state had been effectively set up, but they in the end decided to pretend to have this nationwide conference because that would have great propaganda value. So Kim Gu was used for this propaganda purpose. And yet, even today, he's made out to be the leader who selflessly abstained from becoming the president and wanted to resist the division. Well, all this went on, but all the time there were guerrilla warfare and also fights on behalf of, well, anti-communist forces here, because the border called the 38th parallel was still porous. And so those who saw what was happening in North Korea, those who had anything and who could fled to the south. So we had a very strong core of anti-communist forces here in the south. But also there were pro-communist, pro-Marxist forces, fairly well organized through their party system. So there were fierce fights. I entered junior high school in 1949, and I heard that on the high school campus there were fights with knives. And during the Korean War, when it broke out on June 25th in 1950, Seoul was occupied for about 3 months, as you know. And one of the student leaders was executed on the campus during these 3 months. So the fighting was fierce. And not only that, in some parts of Korea, election couldn't take place, like Jeju Island was off limits. And in order to reclaim Jeju, the new Korean government had to send forces, but those military units that were supposed to go to Jeju revolted in the southern city of Yosu and Suncheon. So there was huge fight and bloodshed. And to this day, memory of all these events where many civilians were involved, really without realizing what was happening. There were guerrilla activities, and they used the civilian covers. So in order to get rid of the guerrillas, the civilians also had to be hit, often cases. And this gave ground to some people like Bruce Cummings, who said that the war, which was actually started by Kim Il-sung deliberately, after visiting Stalin twice to persuade rather reluctant Stalin the desirability of launching a war. They say the war had to take place, and whether North invaded or South invaded doesn't really matter. It's the atrocities that were perpetrated by the ROK and American forces that really exacerbated the situation. This is the line of argument roughly put, advanced by the revisionists. Anyway, this, the war, of course, any war is detrimental, but this is a war which is a civil war, fratricidal war, which turned into an international conflict. And the lines of conflict went back and forth a number of times. Political casualties were even greater than military casualties. You know, 37,000 Americans were killed, wounded, and at least 10 million Koreans were hurt in one way or other. Separated families, people who were killed, wounded. The worst part of it all was that this was a total war in a sense which is much deeper and real than when we use this term total war in talking about the First or Second World Wars. Because there was no line between the civilian population and the military. Many of the accounts reveal that Americans, when first they came, were hit by guerrilla units dressed like ordinary Korean civilians in white garbs, which used to be worn by Koreans. So in retaliation, they sometimes hit the civilian groups, thinking they were guerrillas. In my school, too, I was only in the 7th grade. Students were called to mass and then asked to volunteer. We were too young. I was very lucky to have been born not a year or two earlier. Those who were one class older than we had to be mobilized, and we were left out, luckily. So even high school students, later on when Seoul became territorial Republic of Korea, had to suffer because of the cooperation they had to give to North Koreans. But there were also many who voluntarily went north because until then there was this illusion that North Korea was the ideal land promised by Karl Marx, because most of the Korean Marxists became Marxists through literature spread by the Japanese academic circles, and some of the most brilliant students, and mostly from fairly well-to-do families, became Marxist theoreticians, whereas there were sympathizers, sort of indigenous growth out of resentment, and those who really imbibe the message of dual liberation. So it's rather like the Russian nobility who cheered the success of French Revolution, having the serf orchestra play Marseillaise and not realizing their ground being undercut. Anyway, when the war ended, the casualties were enormous on both sides, but the psychological and psychic scars were much deeper than anything that anybody who did not go through can really imagine. The physical destruction was terrible. North Korea was bombed out, and much of South Korea also was destroyed. But in often cases, in the same family, one brother would be killed by the communists, the other by the ROK forces. This happened everywhere. It all depended on where you were. Also within families, some brothers were pro-communist, wives were anti-communist, the husband the other way, and they didn't speak each other. There's a telling diary left by a historian named Kim Sung-chil, Facing History, it's called, and it's a diary written in the year 1945 and also 1950 and 51. Unfortunately, he was killed in 1951. There's a very revealing phrase, writing down whatever he witnessed each day. He used the term I'll use Korean word first. 이념의 혈연화, which what he meant was that ideology was getting into the bloodstream of people. Ideology, which is something that you had to either accept or reject on the basis of rational calculation or evaluation. No, ideology in Korea was becoming a heritage that passed from son to father. So personal revenge was sort of dressed up as an ideological commitment. So it complicates the picture enormously. After the war, in the South anyway, those who suffered at the hands of the communists could at least speak out. But those who weren't quite sure, who also had a victim who had been punished by the Korean or South Korean side, couldn't speak up. Many families had members missing, but until the 1980s, when the Soviet Union began to loosen up and the tension was much less here, even here, so our Red Cross could advertise the names of missing persons. Families didn't dare speak up that they had missing members for fear that they would be suspected of harboring pro-communist sympathy. In many cases, it was discovered that missing members had all been living under the same sky all these 30 years. So this was the kind of virulent anti-communism that we pursued in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Of course, the situation was much worse in the North. Kim Il-sung veered sharply the other way when, in 1956, Khrushchev started this move to rationalize the system there by making the speech on Stalin's misdeeds, and East European countries started to reform their system. Kim Il-sung instead got rid of all his rivals. There were many native Korean communists, those also who had been active in the struggle for independence in China, the Soviet Union, Manchuria, and including those who had been invited by the Soviet authorities after 1945 to assist building up the new state. All these were wiped out, and that included Park Chung-hee, the leader of the Communist Party, who had suffered enormously under the Japanese and had great authority. For about a year, the American military government allowed free political activities even to the communists in the hope that a genuine national consensus could be worked out. But eventually, knowing that he had been responsible for the guerrilla activity, he was, his activities were made illegal. So he went to the North. But after the war, so he became North Korea's foreign minister, but he was charged with espionage for the United States, and he was executed. So North Korea, in that regard, followed the pattern that Stalin used in the 30s, getting rid of all his rivals. So North Korea was a much more solidly unified political system than South Korea ever was. We, after all, was a liberal democratic state, and we couldn't pursue repression to the extent that North Korea did. But the system was repressive enough to breed newer forces of dissidence. So it was a sort of no-win situation, and the worst part of all this was that we as a nation lost the right to exist without having to lie, that is politically. In order to survive, you had to adhere to the system, to the ideology given, and not speak your mind. I came back to to Korea in 1972, just on the eve of the so-called revitalization or Yushin program. That was the tightening of control by President Park Chung-hee. What I noticed at that time was that President Park Chung-hee, whose ideological stance at that time was somewhat suspect, because he had been involved in the pro-communist activities in the early years. The Americans were not quite easy about where he would go. In fact, President Che Gyuhwa, who just passed away, was the man who came to Korea University, where I came to teach, to persuade the professoriate of the need to to push through this Yushin program. That was really tight control by the quasi-military government. And the argument that he used was basically anti-American. Because of the bad influence of America, Koreans lost nationalistic sense and individualism or simply selfishness, and libertarianism were forces weakening this country, whereas Japan retained its nationalistic militant stance. And I was really shocked because I witnessed the transition from the Japanese rule to the American military government as a third grader. It was the first time in Korea's history that we heard of such words as autonomy, democracy, and all that. But this man was saying that because of this bad influence of America, this country was really getting rather shaky. Well, unfortunately, the Park Chung-hee government pursued a program of strongly anti-communist, nationalist education. And I think this nationalist education sank, the emphasis on nationalism. In the grade school, in the kindergarten, and the junior levels of high school. But by the time children grew and they became, say, university students, they began to see that the system around was very repressive politically, and the communist system was just nowhere to be seen. Only in word you heard about communism. The generation of people who had lived through the war did not need to have communism explained to them. But for the younger generation, we had to do a better job of educating them on why we had to oppose communism. Nothing of the sort was done. I kept insisting that this was going to backfire. My younger daughter in the second grade once came and said, "Mom, you say there are communists in the North because you wanted us to study hard." And as a Russia specialist, I knew what was happening on the eve of the Russian Revolution. My books, which contained many books on Russia and some even on the French Revolution, they were confiscated. So it took me 6 months to reclaim them, and I was able to have them released in 1972 on condition that I would donate them to the Asiatic Research Center at Korea University. So even university students were not allowed to study about communism. Even standard Western accounts on communism were banned. But what in fact was happening was their curiosity was enormous, and the curiosity was satisfied by certain type of literature, basically pro-communist. When I saw some of these books from the academic point of view, they were so shoddy that I just thought that I could ignore them, and that was a great mistake. They became the textbooks in the underground curriculum the students used. What I noticed gradually was that while still in the 70s, my lectures on Russian history and others, especially Russian history, was still popular, and my Harvard degree was something of an asset. But in the 80s, after the Gwangju uprising in 1980, and rather savage suppression, the situation had changed. And in the eyes of the students, my American education meant that I had been sold. And this was happening at the best of the universities in Korea. So in a way, what is happening today is the price we are paying for the stupid way in which we managed our anti-communist education. So when the Soviet Union was already disintegrating from within, that is in the 80s, we ended up having student movements in most of the major universities, the student government, dominated by pro-North groups, what is called National Liberation Front, the two major branches, National Liberation and Popular Democracy, NL and PD. On the surface, they were fighting for democratization of this country, but underneath, increasingly, they were being dominated by pro-socialist or pro-North elements. And I'm quite sure North Korea did not sit idle all this time. In spite of all its weaknesses, it's a country that has maintained its system of propaganda and agitation intact. And they were reaching out. So when, after the Olympic Games of 1988, the Soviet Union was really very impressed, and they were very anxious to cultivate new ties with Korea. The ideologue of Mr. Gorbachev, a man named Medvedev, Roy Medvedev, came and addressed the student at SNU. And he was asked such questions. How can the Soviet Union, the fatherland of socialism, abandon its course? That was in the early 90s. So Medvedev later told me that if I had known, if we had known that this was happening in Korea, we would not have taken would have the decision to abandon communism. Well, then, of course, what was not expected happened. That is, finally, we managed to have purely civilian government elected, so-called democratization came. And you saw the two former presidents being tried and put into prison and all that. Democratization in that regard has been a double-edged sword. It's a very healthy development for which we are thankful, in that it has given an opportunity for the opposition to get into power and have taste of power, have a new sense of responsibility. On the other hand, democratization also meant that it was time to pay for the past mistakes. So the development in the 90s, after the end of the Cold War in Europe, has been peculiar in this country. End of the Cold War meant elsewhere in the world that communism collapsed and the former communists acknowledged that their system failed. But in Korea, on the contrary, end of the Cold War is used as a weapon with which to discourage any sort of criticism of communist system. So anyone who is critical of North Korea is branded a person with a Cold War mentality. So no real ideological debate has really taken place. It just went from almost obscurantist anti-communism to pro-communist leanings. Those whose feelings, whose resentment had been suppressed came to the fore. And because we did not really teach anything about communism, how communist system operated, what their history really was like, the conclusion many young people, especially those who spent all their university years demonstrating every year and not reading any decent book from cover to cover, that's imbibing this underground literature that was fed them, they just concluded that North Korea, after all, must be just our counterpart, only slightly poorer than we. They have no idea how that system really worked. The ringleaders of the North Korea, the National Liberation Group, in fact, there's one man named Kim Young-han. He was smuggled into North Korea at the end of the 80s by a submarine. He was the man who wrote a pamphlet which reads like the pamphlet Lenin wrote on the eve of the Russian Revolution to educate the revolutionaries. Digest of Marxist, the notion of a class struggle, enormous emphasis on the need to cultivate moral personality, dedication to the national and popular cause, all the elements that would appeal to the young minds. And then there was also a part that is a sheer training for revolutionary activities, how you should behave when you are arrested and tortured and so forth. This man was smuggled to North Korea, but then he saw immediately that he had been deceived. So after coming back for a number of years, he tried to dissolve whatever he had wrote. Eventually, he confessed his mistake, and I think he worked out some sort of an arrangement, so he was pardoned. So now those who are most active in the so-called New Right movement consist of this core group who had fought for democratic rights and then decided that North Korea was a better system than South Korea, and then they were disillusioned and awakened. So they are now spearheading the movement to fight for the rights of North Koreans. But people like Kim were few. Those who, in a way, had been educated by him had less courage. For about half a decade after the collapse of the Soviet system, the student movement here was lull, went through a period of lull, and they didn't know what to do. But the economic crisis of 1997 revived this current. And then with a combination of anti-communist agitation that North Korea had been instigating all the way, it became a force that suddenly saw the light. It's a combination, strange combination of the new confidence coming from Korea's economic and political successes, and then sheer ignorance and lack of reliable information on the communist world that has produced this dynamite in a way. And it is this force that drove our current president into power in the fall of year 2002. You recall how the World Cup Games produced this worldwide phenomenon of Koreans cheering, calling out the name of Daehanmin국, the Republic of Korea. I was deeply moved because it was the first time in my memory that the name Republic of Korea was being shouted out in such a unison. And I thought finally we had overcome the past scars. Koreans were self-confident, and the past division and the scars that stemmed from it were in the past. But unfortunately, that euphoria degenerated into this anti-communist rally because of this unfortunate killing of the two young girls, accidental death, but this was exploited by dissident elements. So President Roh rode into power on anti-American sentiment, which was fanned. For the majority of Koreans, what was happening was something that was just so incredible. We thought that this couldn't happen, this was not happening, but it did happen. Because there was enough pent-up resentment and anger that could be used as a fuel. It does not represent, naturally, all of Korean society. As you know, it's reflected in the sharp drop in the popularity rating of the president and the governing party. But still, there was the ground for it. It's a healthy development, that is rewriting history. Revisionist attempt is a healthy development in the sense that voice had to be given to those whose voices had been totally suppressed for so many years. And the genuine national reconciliation called for their coming out. But on the other hand, their voices have to be correlated with the voices of the other half, who also suffered enormously. But since the power had been on one side, now the other side claims monopoly of power in retaliation. One of the gimmicks that North Korea has been using was this note of nationalism, this notion of autonomy, independence, and the Koreans together, 민족끼리. And it sounds very appealing because so much damage, so much suffering had been caused by the division and the war. So it has, these slogans have enormous emotional appeal. But of course, two Koreas have gone on different paths for 60 years. And the reality is obscured. But because of the pain and because North Korea is an issue that few Koreans are really willing to face realistically, because it's an issue that just could not be resolved. Many people had their immediate families in the North. Many cases, a man with the eldest son fled to the South, leaving behind the families. And then the reverse happened. I have my high school teachers, a lady whose husband was a brilliant young physicist. He was taken north. They had a son who now is a professor at SNU. And then there was another teacher who had come from North by himself, and his family was there. So for years, they waited because we did not know how long this division would last. They were hoping the two parts could be brought together, and they finally married each other and had a new family. But this whole thing became a real scar when the son by the husband, the former husband, was such a brilliant student that he made the top in the national entrance examination, and the whole thing came out in the newspaper, and it was found that his father and he had different surnames. So there are countless people like that who say that they wanted unification, because unification is a cause that no Korean could really deny in the open. But what would happen if these families were brought together? So everybody, in a way, became sort of guilty without having committed anything specifically bad. And many people lived with bad conscience because not knowing whether your father was living or alive, you didn't know whether to start commemoration service or not. Either way, you suffered. So all these have to be aired out. So in that regard, what is happening today, the sort of a mild form of cultural revolution, is a process that this country has to go through. But unfortunately, this process is not taking place within this society without outside interference. But North Korea's propaganda is reflected in these slogans. One of the things is, as I earlier alluded to, dealing with the question of Japanese collaborators. Of course, the first generation all died out practically. But there's a strong insistence that this issue had to be dealt with. It is true, every country, France or any country, dealt with this issue, war criminals and collaborators, much better than we did. What makes the situation complicated is that North Korea is using this to denigrate the legitimacy of the Republic of Korea. So practically everyone who had been instrumental in building up this country can be charged with collaboration with the Japanese, because they were the people who were educated under the Japanese, had built up some sort of expertise. So I think the peak of this movement, which I think was instigated from behind by North Korea, came last year when there was this movement to pull down the statue of General MacArthur. And this, fortunately, I think became a turning point in the general public's awareness of what was happening and how the situation was being used by North Korea. The sunshine policy of President Kim Dae-jung was a welcome note because it promised resolution of this sick problem in a peaceful, palatable manner. The gist, of course, as you all probably know, is that after all, the Soviet Union and the United States, the two responsible parties for our division, are now calling themselves partners. Why should we remain antagonistic to each other? Naturally, this is true. And the second, we have to, since South Korea is doing so much better, and we now have self-confidence, and no matter what, the burden of feeding our brethren in the North would fall upon us in a major way. It's much better to have that system develop into a normal state, functioning economy, than to have it collapse upon us. So let's assist them to do that. And this way also, by wiping out their mistrust and fear, we can have peaceful coexistence, and then eventually work toward unification. Faultless argument. And also there were two conditions that President Kim Dae-jung attached. That is, no provocation would be allowed, and the Korean-American alliance will remain strong. This would be the cornerstone. And President Kim Dae-jung used to say in public and in small circles that even Kim Jong-il agreed the desirability of continued American presence. After all, it's not, whether we are unified or not, because of the potential threat posed by Japan and China and even Russia. So I was one of President Kim Dae-jung's ambassadors, and I bought the argument myself. But in the way this policy was being executed, sitting still in Moscow, I began to worry immediately. North Korea was using this in their own way. Former foreign minister who defected to the North, the only one such a prominent case. She was the one who was one of the leaders in the counter-South propagation unit. And she came as the leader of the delegation. We should have rejected it, of course, rejected her. Nothing of that sort happened. And ever since, North Korea has been testing this country's awareness of what was going on. And North Korea has never given up the claim to be the only legitimate representative of the entire peninsula. So they insisted on dealing with the United States directly, and only in slogan they say Koreans together. But in actuality, they've never really recognized South Korea as an equal. So little by little, people here began to lose this sense of God, sense of fear vis-à-vis North Korea, whereas North Korea, in my mind, has not changed. But because of the wishful thinking and the deception to which the society has fallen victim, people don't even feel anything when North Korea announced that it even tested nuclear weapons development. Anyway, history rewriting is one wedge that pro-North forces have used to convince the Korean nation that we no longer have to put up with the division and have to rewrite history from the point of view of a unified Korea. This is the argument that they use to bring up, or history has to be viewed in such a way that Korea is seen as a unified whole. So that makes Republic of Korea not a viable unit. But very few people see through this. So in their historiography, Dr. Seung-man Rhee and General MacArthur are the two arch culprits for the division of the country and all the tragedy that ensued. Well, as I say, the turning point was reached last year, and now there are forces which try to counter this wrong-headed interpretation of a history, but still the work had already been progressing for so long. The all-powerful teachers' union has been dominated by the pro-North elements. The wrong kind of history is being taught. So now there's a fierce battle which people refer to as South-South conflict. There's North-South conflict, but South-South conflict. And in a way, I mean, they are, of course, intimately linked, and South-South conflict is something that is very difficult to grasp. We do not know at this point how deeply this system has been penetrated by North Korea's agents. Only today, I think there was an outright comment on this in one of the major newspapers. And this kind of talk would be, of course, immediately counterattacked by saying this is a Cold War mentality and so forth. But as someone who is familiar with the old communist system, and not only that, you know, after all, international relations are such that every country is a rival, if not enemy of another. And unless Kim Jong-il is an absolute fool, which he's not, it was so easy to work from within this system to inculcate their way of viewing the history and the world. So, in a way, my talk tonight is a very painful confession of the failure of the education system here, and appeal for patient understanding of the struggle that we are waging right now. I'm afraid that if we don't understand the situation correctly, also I appeal to our American friends as well, whose sensitivities are naturally enormously hurt, that we are fighting. And we don't want to have won every battle only to lose the war. Maybe my view is somewhat exaggerated, because I happen to have studied secret organization as part of my doctoral dissertation. Just by chance, I was working on the subject of Freemasonry as possible source of this phenomenon you know as the Russian intelligentsia. And I just discovered that, in fact, the German court was using the secret network to ensnare Russia's Grand Duke Paul, who was the son and political rival of Catherine the Great. And this kind of secret network is the one that any revolutionary groups utilize, and especially the communist systems, very effectively. In the 80s, sitting at the university, there were people who were sketching out the picture of the student movement as I described to you. But few people believed it. For instance, Park Chung-hee of Seoul University, the chancellor of the university at that time, was one of the few people who were talking about this. Everyone thought that his view was exaggerated, but it all turns out to have been the case. And now there are a large number of people who had been persuaded to follow the Juche NL line, and who since then to recant it. And they now say there are many people who had been educated by them personally and who had absorbed pro-North system of thinking, who are now active. So I'm very, very sorry that we have not been able to prevent this, but now we are aware of what is going on. And I think the public also is much more aware since last year of the danger we are facing. But unfortunately, our government and the governing circle seem still not quite sure of where to go. And this hesitation that they show in the face of North Korea's wanting to become a nuclear power is very worrisome. But I really would like to appeal our friends that Korea should not be given up. we do have the strength, only political power at the moment is not being used in the way in which we should. So rewriting history has this complicated background. Rewriting history was necessary and is necessary. There are many suppressed chapters that have to be rewritten. Balance should be restored, but at the moment it's going to the other extreme. And this explains the volatility of the intellectual scene here and the enigmatic picture that this country is facing. So in a larger sense, this is a country that is going through this painful search for its identity, and I'm sure we will pull through. But right now, the situation is very, very complicated. Thank you.